let me hand over to our first speaker, who will deal with Dr. Mtimka, who will deal with how do we negotiate, the negotiation and consensus seeking amongst the political parties, and also the dynamics within political parties of coalitions. We know how difficult it has been to manage the various policy positions, personalities, etc., within the various political parties. Over to you, Ongama.
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, Doc. Greetings to the leadership. I stand on the protocol that you've just established. I've heard that said somewhere recently, so I thought it's a cool thing to say to try and avoid offending people. Please pardon my, I don't have a list of everybody whom I should be acknowledging, but yeah, I'm grateful for the invitation that I've received, especially in my new role at the Nelson Mandela University. I am in the Raymond Mhlaba Center for Governance and Leadership, and we want to get close to processes of state building as a center named after Omre, as well as a university that's based in the Eastern Cape, where much of the work is needed in terms of boosting state capacity and influencing the political to achieve the right objectives as far as, achieving development, better development outcomes. So I thought I'll take this with both hands, negotiating and consensus seeking. Whoever came up with this title knows what I love to do. So I'm grateful for that. This is something that I've devoted my time to do. So what I want to do is just 4 broad areas that I'm going to be focusing on, and I've just started my clock here just so I don't talk. We are used to 45 minutes as academics, minimum 45 minutes. So I'm trying to make sure that I stick to the time. So I want to take a broad theoretical framework or approach. And look at also the nature of decision-making in democracies. I think this is a good context for us. And then dealing with the two issues that are implied in the topic, negotiating and consensus seeking, and then also on the dynamics. So from a broad theoretical perspective, I think this is a very important slide for me, if everything else is forgotten. I subscribe to the theory that everything is interrelated, systems theory. This is something that I subscribe to, which I believe is an approach that we should take when it comes to, viewing the world and phenomena that is taking place. Within systems theory, the idea is that a system is an integrated whole whose properties cannot be reduced to those of its parts. And systems theory, or the perspective itself, is a way of looking at the universe as one whole consisting of various parts. And this was important in terms of the philosophical traditions within the social and natural sciences, and have got huge implications because, the original approach in terms of how humans saw the world was that it was this big integrated organism that needed to be respected. Mother Nature, for example, would be references to the natural world. And then in the Enlightenment, and I'd say Enlightenment in Europe particularly, because what Europe calls Enlightenment was not, in fact, global enlightenment. Africa had been enlightened long before the period of Enlightenment. China had been enlightened. The Arab world had been enlightened. The Middle East, had inspired civilizations long before Europe came into the scene and makes reference to Enlightenment. Anyway, the thinking in Enlightenment was that the world became viewed in a mechanistic way. And what that meant is that the natural resources could be pillaged, among many other things that happened. And then as a result of that, we saw a lot of destruction, we saw a lot of pushback from nature that says we are a whole, and if you try and manipulate different parts without due regard for how all of the parts affect others, you're going to be in trouble, and we've seen the trouble. The other thing I want to highlight, maybe I'll skip it for now, this concept of a hold-on, but I want to talk to when I get to the political parties later on. The other broad theoretical issue that I thought is important to mention is this contribution from chaos theory that phenomena have different ways in which they contribute to order in the world. So, for example, they say a butterfly flapping its wings in one corner of the world can generate, underline this, the initial conditions for what becomes a tornado elsewhere in the world. So this butterfly may be in China, generating a tornado in East London. We saw this in COVID-19, how whether you are a lab theorist or a natural species infection theorist, the idea is that one section of Wuhan, which is a part of the world, people flapping their wings, so bats flapping their wings, being bats, ended up through the meat markets there, influencing, the meat market there. But it caused a global pandemic. Likewise, if you are a lab theorist that the pandemic came from a lab, the point is the same, that it's a butterfly flapping its wings in one corner of the world, people researching, some chemical weaponry, whatever they were doing. But what they did affected all of us globally. One, there's a war in Ukraine, and the price of maize in Africa is skyrocketing. Why did I say that? All of those things. I'm saying it, there's no action too small. There's no butterfly too small flapping its wings that cannot generate the initial conditions for a tornado elsewhere. So the reason why, again, closer to home, constitutional court justices were just acting within the institution of the constitutional court. They take a decision, imprison a former head of state, and as a result of that, we saw billions of rands worth of, consequences. The nature of democratic governance is that, one, at the core of it is that it's meant to be broad. It's meant to be about the people at large, to the extent that democracy is defined as the government of the people, by the people, for the people. But the challenge with democratic governance is that there's a lot of processes involved, because if not even a family can agree. So it's even more worse when it's broader institutions with many people. So what then happens is that political parties in democracies serve to aggregate the interests in a society, and that aggregation work happens in its own policy processes, in its own conferences, and as a result of that, we get to have preferences by these political parties. When it comes to negotiating and consensus seeking, here the reference obviously is made to the context of a government of national unity. But first, I want to talk about how we are dealing with, these two questions, the negotiation, the consensus seeking, as well as the dynamics of the system itself, in terms of party priorities and coalition priorities. I thought I'd put them together as to what is it that they are responding to. So democratic government is about how to advance the interests of society at large. If there were no power structures in society, all that would happen is that we would elect a government. Again, that process creates power structures. We'll elect a government, and the government would simply study who needs what the most and deliver that. Now, we're saying governments, however, even democratic governments, are highly contested, and political parties are acting within an environment of high contestation. So I'm going to try and squeeze this in the 2.5 minutes that my clock is showing me. So if governments then are highly contested, and you've got power structures that influence the extent to which governments perform, it begs the question: how do they negotiate this space to have priorities that they can, that can help them to advance the greater good? Here is the issue in terms of which power structures or which constellations of power continue to have influence in South Africa. One, we have the power of established capital and owners of wealth in the country. What is the precise ways in which these people influence the country? One, they place limitations on the extent to which governments, for example, can raise taxes in order to achieve what is required. If there's as Thomas Piketty, advised, there's considerations of a wealth tax. Once governments start attempting to, come up with wealth tax or other mechanisms to generate more income from this class, whether it's foreign or domestic, there are usually responses, market responses. Some of those responses are through the mechanisms of stock exchanges, through the mechanisms of bond markets, through the mechanisms of responses in terms of price manipulation and other things. Now, why did I mention this? Because it's a power structure that we must contend with, that we must interpret in terms of whether it enables our work or it constrains our work. But they also, this group doesn't just exist to constrain the power of politicians. They also play a big role in employing people, in manufacturing the goods and services that are needed. Now, it's beyond today, but we need a political, these political parties that have emerged, for example, in the GNU, a GNU that is seen in a positive light by this power group network. And by the way, there was some disappointment from this group, because even though they expected the ANC to lose power, they didn't want the ANC to lose power beyond 45%, because at that time, at that threshold, that's the threshold in which the governing party would be vulnerable to huge ideological shifts, either to the left or to the right. And so the initial market responses when the results were announced at the lower 40s were one of panic, because at that 40%, you could have too many radical alternatives to policy. However, these parties that have been in the GNU have been able to remain on that continuum from the center left to the center right in terms of policy outlook. I was listening this week to Honorable Minister John Steenhuisen, towing the global South line, but also advancing the strategic interests of South Africa in defending the relationship with China. Anyway, an issue for another day. The other issue that our political environment is contending with is the power of political elites and their character. Now, we know that the South African state has been corrupt since time immemorial. And there's been attempts, especially since 1994, to try and transform it. And Henny van Vuuren makes the point that in 1994, what we're doing is we're not trying, it's not inheriting a good government and which becomes bad in the democratic period. He makes the point that, in fact, it's inheriting a government that had been prone to corruption. About 574 billion had been lost from the fiscus, as Annie van Vuuren says, through corrupt dealings, among other things. So it's been a long process of attempting to transform the South African state. Yes, that is done with some degree of success in the democratic period, institutions being put in to try and regulate the behavior of politicians. And then we know that there was an attack, sustained attack on this, and there's a process now, we are told, of attempting to rebuild what was lost. But this process is not happening in a vacuum. Now, in a coalition environment, the major parties that are in the coalition have committed themselves to continuing the fight against corruption. And I'm happy that they resisted the agitations that were coming from some of the circles in the political space to create super ministries that were controlled by each political party. What they've done, they've created parties where they are shared there's shared political leadership. My view is that this should create the necessary environment for collaboration and mutual checks and balances among the political leaders in the departments that are fortunate to have deputies, senior political leadership that comes from diverse backgrounds. This one of the power of the lumpen proletariat, or what Karl Marx called the dangerous classes, is a huge issue. I mean, this week we're talking about killings in Mthatha, killings in KZN, killings everywhere, recently in the Western Cape also, where the state is attempting to, again, awaken from its slumber because groups have arisen in the country who are challenging the monopoly of the state on violence. And among the key indicators of state failure is the extent to which the state can retain that monopoly of violence. And we've seen our state being undermined severely by either groups of citizens that are mobilized by groups with nefarious interests in the July 21 unrests, or by pockets of organized criminals that are attempting to terrorize business, state, as well as other and civil society, it's a society in general. So this is a power that the state is awakening to, and it's good to hear that there's some processes at the level of the government of national unity to deal with this. But this has got to do a lot with state capacity. And lastly, in terms of these powers, then I argue that it's no longer okay for us in South Africa to talk about grand narratives in ways that we have in previous times. So, for example, we talk about whiteness as the issue because we're a country that has inherited colonialism and apartheid. My view is that while that remains a useful characterization of in economic inequality in South Africa, it's no longer enough to explain what we must struggle against. My view is that these three broad power constellations are what we need to contend with, and they include, especially in the two, the power of political elites and the power of the so-called dangerous classes. They include these politicians who are saying they are existing to fight this. I don't know if I still have time, because then I could do this last slide that talks about the so what in this negotiation of priorities, among other things. Do I still have time, ma'am?
Yes, you can do and then wrap up. Thanks.
Okay, so I thought that I wouldn't bore colleagues by repeating the history that unfolded in front of us. We know that the GNU itself was a process of, maybe let me go back to the the idea of a holon that I spoke about earlier as I'm about to wrap up on this slide. So a holon, as Arthur Kuster explains, has got two opposite tendencies in a system. One, a holon is a whole in itself. It is a theoretical construct that underscores this idea of parts who are wholes in themselves, but parts in relation to the bigger whole. Now, there are two opposite tendencies as far as Arthur Koestler is concerned. One, a tendency to integrate so as to function as part of a larger whole. So making compromises, working with others, a give and take process. That's one. And that was how South Africa was able to break, to set a world record as far as I'm concerned, or to at least contend for top position in the world for constituting a coalition government within 14 days. We mustn't forget how miraculous this was, especially when this coalition brought about two big factions of society now. The white voter bloc and the black voter bloc, sections of them, obviously. So this, to me, is it shouldn't be something that we take for granted, because it took a lot of that tendency in systems to collaborate. Okay. But there's another tendency. There's a tendency to assert autonomy. And we saw this tendency happen in Gauteng. We saw it happen where, even though the ANC and the DA, among all the other parties, collaborated as systems do to create a government of national unity, that at provincial levels, it's interesting, especially Gauteng seems to be a hotspot for this autonomy and integration tendency. So in Gauteng, there was an assertion of the autonomy at a sub-national level of the same political party at a national level that is actually tending towards integration and collaboration, which assert autonomy and says we are not going to collaborate on some other aspects. And then we're seeing this play out in municipalities. The bigger question, which I'm not going to answer today, but it's something that I'm focusing my analytical mind on, is at what point will there be some breaking, a flapping of the butterfly in one corner of South Africa, which has got consequences at the national level? This is why I've been saying my diagnosis of the political stability is a critical and somewhat stable, arrangement, because we don't know what flapping of wings somewhere at a sub-national level is going to cause a tsunami that undoes what has been done so far in terms of the GNU. But what gives me comfort so far is that the political players have been negotiating consensus and sticking together. And foreign affairs, for me, is the most exciting aspect in which that is happening, where you find that politicians that had seemingly stood in opposition for South Africa's foreign policy with respect to the Far East as well as the Global South agenda are now singing in tandem with one another. And I'm saying that that's an interesting thing that we can also see on issues like corruption, on issues like priorities to advance or to accelerate development. And lastly, the acid test, and this is where many of yourselves, colleagues, and our work collectively within the community of people that seek to build state capacity is going to come. The extent to which we can influence public officials who are assertive about who they are and their competencies, even as they play a collaborative and a submissive role, so that political leadership, because in the final analysis, it's politicians whom we vote for. So as they provide leadership to say, these are our priorities, public sector officials should have enough humility to give expression to those priorities and enough boldness and autonomy to resist every aspect of corrupting tendencies of politicians and business and themselves, by the way, so that the national interest can be achieved and the national priorities can be achieved. Last statement. I did work on the Kucha project for my master's treatise, and I wrote that Kucha presented to us an example of creative politicking in post-apartheid South Africa, where executives played enough of the political game to lobby and get resources for their mandates. That's okay, that is perfect. But stayed distant enough not to allow that activity of lobbying for resources for their departments, lobbying for resources for their entities to be corrupting. And I argue that what my finding was that these executives were committed more to the cause than to the personalities involved. And as a result of that, could manage the tension between effective lobbying and capture, which tends to be predatory. Thanks a lot. And I hope for opportunities for us to get closer to the NSG and others. We've already, I'm happy that the NSG has already established, for example, MOUs with different universities so that we can continue